From a media perspective, in your world of professional mixed martial arts, one experiment that did not work, clearly, was when the UFC team, they still have, their thing going on, but they teamed up with ESPN. And they tried a square peg, round hole approach with Stephen A. Smith. What do you make of them assigning Stephen A., and do you believe that it was a failure?
The UFC and ESPN relationship is just fraught more generally at this point. It's a really interesting kind of conversation. We don't have all that much time to get into it, but those two people are those two entities are in a weird place. When they signed their deal, what was it, 6 or 7 years ago at this point? The first few years of that deal was just a rousing success, and that's really where you saw Stephen A. for the most part, was early on, early big events, early, let's get the word out about UFC on ESPN at the time, and this is part of the reason why ESPN signed UFC, was to help build their ESPN Plus subscription base, and then UFC was very, very instrumental in doing that. For folks who may not know, prior to the ESPN deal, if you want to buy UFC pay-per-view, folks will remember, you could probably just go to your Verizon or Comcast or whatever your, DirecTV, whatever it was, and you could buy from there. And then when they went to ESPN, 100% of pay-per-view buys had to happen through ESPN Plus. And so that was a big driver for them. And so this is all about getting the word out in that sense. To be honest, the Steven thing didn't work. There was one kind of famous thing where he said against the Connor that Cowboy Cerrone, kind of quit, and then there was a lot of backlash. And then Cerrone kind of half confirmed it, and Steven, I think, took a little bit of shine to that. I worked with Steven one time on the boxing side, which was for Showtime. He joined us on the, it was a very informal thing, but he joined us on the Spence Crawford weigh-ins, and he was very friendly. And I've actually watched a lot of his boxing coverage. I think his boxing coverage is actually pretty helpful for both either Top Rank, who's on on ESPN, or really any entity he takes interest in. I think that is a partnership that actually works pretty well. It did not work with UFC audiences. Again, for hardcore fans, it didn't work. From ESPN's point of view, did he help raise visibility and help drive subscriptions to their service? Probably they got something out of it, but it didn't last long enough for it to really matter. Like of all the things I think about now between UFC and ESPN and where that deal might go and where they are now, what happened with Steven is like at the bottom of the list. You know what I mean? Like it's a perfectly reasonable question because at the time it was so hot, but they're so far into such a different place that it's like, honestly, I'm not saying that fans might welcome back Steven, but the point I would make is ESPN appears to be so unhappy with UFC. I don't think they would even want to waste Steven's time. That's kind of the difference.
Why do you
Today.
feel that way?
Well, you might, and I think he's done it even recently, you'll still see Dana White or potentially some other big UFC star do First Take. There's still big overlap with that. Like, that is absolutely still a thing that would happen. But what you were referring to was putting Steven on a UFC broadcast. The basic answer of what has happened, and this is kind of again, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of it, or a little bit shorter. The UFC is a monopoly. It does not matter what definition of monopoly. I mean, it's a monopsony, so it's not one seller, it's one buyer, but it's a monopoly. It's a monopoly by any measurement. I mean, all the way, understand something. We're now in 2025. There are documents that we found from a class action lawsuit that their fighters waged against them from Deutsche Bank in 2009, saying of every dollar generated in the MMA industry, so the whole bit, the UFC takes 90 cents. That was 2009. Their power has only entrenched since then. They have the vast majority of the world's best fighters. But what has happened over time is in 2016, the people who really built the UFC into the thing that you knew to be that powerhouse, the McGregor powerhouse, the Ronda Rousey powerhouse, they sold to Endeavor, which of course, now is TKO, or Endeavor kind of split, but you get the same idea, same ownership group. And they have gone from the let's build this thing to a global phenomenon into just a wealth extraction business. And You could ask any, like, go on Reddit for MMA now, and like, by all means, don't take my word for it. Look at the amount of fan consternation about the state of the product. Like, no one else can compete because of how much they control the industry, but at the same time, they're penny pinching in ways where you're seeing elite prospects emerge on the regional scene, and the UFC doesn't want to match what they're paying or being paid by a regional, like, like what they're making in Poland. They don't want to match what some of these guys are making in Poland, and so you're missing out on top prospects. They put out content every week where it's a lot of just nameless faces and whatnot. And more to the point, what's the most interesting part is that pay-per-view, used to be the most important way in which they made money. And it's still very, very important, but understand something about pay-per-view. If you put on Brock Lesnar, you'll sell a gazillion pay-per-view buys, or at least in his heyday, you would have.
Mm-hmm.
If you put on me, you're not going to sell much at all. And so at that point, you're in the superstar business. But what they ended up doing is changing their business model through 2016 to a degree where they went to contracted revenue. So they were trying to get as much baked into how they do their operations rather than what they even called a lumpy way to make money, where you have a big Brock fight, it hits. You have a big Conor fight, it hits. Those are still important things to have, certainly. I don't want to minimize it, but it's not the same. And so there's become this kind of like homogenization, and they haven't really invested in building stars. If I had to ask someone who's the biggest star in the UFC, you can't count Conor and you can't count John Jones. Could the casual fan even tell me anybody who that is? Mm-hmm. Could you tell me who the biggest celebrity female fighter is today in MMA? I mean, this used to be a very easy question to answer. You could say Ronda Rousey and then several of her chief rivals. Those days are long since past. And so ESPN, to answer the question, has basically, I won't say stopped, but they put on free TV far fewer UFC events than they ever have. They rarely put it on linear TV. I mean, I remember when Cain Velasquez fought Francis Ngannou. When that event ended, they went to a hosted by Ariel Helwani and Chael Sonnen version of Sports Center. I don't think it's happened since. That you absolutely never see that kind of thing, because it looks like ESPN, I think they would still want to be in business to some degree with UFC, particularly on the pay-per-view side, but those numbers have fallen off a cliff. It's been widely reported those numbers have declined dramatically. Again, part of that is the change in the nature of pay-per-view. That's independent of how UFC runs their business, but ESPN appears to be quite unhappy with the state of their deal, and some of the problems are their own. ESPN Plus is the worst streaming service that exists on earth. I don't care what anybody else says, and like they have often ruined a good UFC night more than a time or two. But let's just say that there's a lot of friction these days between ESPN and UFC.